The endless void of space stretched out before Captain Zal, his eyes locked on the chaotic destruction unfolding around him, his warship, once a symbol of the Karnathi Empire, now a broken shell drifting toward the singularity of a dying star. The light from the star cast an eerie glow over the remains of his vessel, the flickering lights casting shadows across the empty bridge. Zal stood motionless, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the flashing red alerts on his console. The enemy had taken everything from them. Their fleet shattered, their forces in disarray. And now this, the final blow, the inevitable end. As his ship spiraled closer to the star, Zal could feel the pull of the star's gravity tugging at him, his breath shallow, his mind numb. The war was over. The Karnathi were defeated, their empire was crumbling, and there was nothing left but the heat of the star, ready to swallow them whole. Zal's thoughts raced to his crew, his officers all gone, their bodies lost in the wreckage. The ones who had fought alongside him, now reduced to ashes, scattered across the cold void of space. And yet, even as he stood there watching the countdown to his death, Zal could not bring himself to accept it. His pride, his honor, the legacy of his people still clung to him, even as the stars seemed to fade around him. For a brief moment, he thought of the human enemies they had fought against, and the cold hatred that had defined their battle. But now, in this moment of utter helplessness, it seemed pointless. He wondered what they would have said to him now as his ship sank toward oblivion. Would they have relished his death? Would they have laughed as the final embers of his ship were snuffed out by the crushing forces of the star's gravity? Or would they have shown him mercy? He clenched his fists, his thoughts heavy with a strange sense of regret. It was then that he heard it, a voice cutting through the static, a voice unmistakably human, soft at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. No one had come to save him, not the Karnathi Empire, not the coalition of free worlds. No one would be coming now. Zal's eyes widened as the voice echoed again. This time it was louder, almost as though it were inside his very mind. A voice that was confident and resolute, but also calm, the kind of voice you would expect from a commander leading his men into battle. And yet this voice carried no malice, no anger, just determination. Zal took a sharp breath, his fingers trembling as he gripped the edge of his console. What trickery was this? He thought no human had ever dared approach them before. Their ships were far too advanced, far too powerful for any enemy to stand against him alone in the heart of his dying ship. He wondered if the voice was just a delusion, something his mind had conjured to make the end seem less inevitable. But then the words came again, louder now and clearer than before. "I won't let you die." Zal's breath caught in his throat. The words felt real, too real to be a hallucination. And yet they were impossible, yet undeniable. Somehow, against all reason, the voice was there, and it was offering him a chance to survive, a chance he had no right to expect, and no understanding of how it was even possible. Zal's mind reeled as the voice echoed in his ears again. He tried to shake off the absurdity of it, but there was something undeniable about it, something that forced him to listen, something that made his heart beat faster despite the inevitable death that was closing in around him. He gritted his teeth, trying to push aside the surge of emotions that came with the voice. He had no time for weakness, no time for hope, not when he had already lost everything. The ship groaned under the strain of its dying systems, the alarms blaring, warning him of the impending doom as the star's gravity continued to pull them in the inevitable end of his journey. As the last captain of the Karnathi Empire, Zal slammed his fist against the console. How could this be happening? Why was this voice speaking to him now? Was it an illusion, a last desperate attempt of his mind to protect him from the crushing reality of his fate? He had seen death many times throughout his life, but this time it felt different. There was a feeling, a tug in his chest, a longing to believe that something else could happen, something he had never allowed himself to consider. He had never once thought about mercy or kindness. In the heat of battle, everything had always been about survival. The ruthless logic of his people had shaped him into the man he was, but this human voice seemed to defy all that. It carried no threat, no promises of conquest or revenge. It only offered something he could not understand, something alien to him, but something that struck a chord deep inside him. Zal closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts, or rather trying to push the storm of confusion away. He had to focus, he had to make a choice. He had fought for the Karnathi Empire all his life, But now, with the end so close, was there any point to it all? Was there a reason to keep fighting when the only thing left was the void, and the pull of the star slowly devouring him? He wanted to believe in this voice. He wanted to hold on to something, anything that might give him a sliver of hope. But he didn't trust it. He didn't trust anything, not after everything he had seen and lost. Yet the voice came again, a simple phrase cutting through the noise, as if the human knew exactly what was happening. "I won't let you die." Zal felt his chest tighten, as if the words themselves were a physical force, something that reached into him and gripped his very soul. How could this human have the audacity to speak those words? How could someone from a species that had fought against him for so long offer him such a gift? The voice continued, urging him to move forward, to reach a place he could not yet see, to take a step toward survival. But Zal hesitated for a long moment, his mind clashing with his instincts. He had always known where to go, where to fight, how to make the kill. But this was different. This was about surviving something far more uncertain than any battlefield had ever been before. And still the voice persisted, offering no reason, no explanation, just the promise of something that might be the very thing he needed to survive against all odds. Zal took a shaky breath, his eyes darting around the wreckage of the bridge, the star's deadly glow creeping closer and closer with every passing second. He didn't know why, but something in him made him listen to the voice. Something in him made him rise from his seat and move toward the escape pods, his legs unsteady, his thoughts unclear. But he moved nonetheless, as if guided by a force beyond his understanding. The voice was clearer now, louder, as though it was speaking directly into his mind, guiding him through the labyrinth of ruined corridors that had once been the heart of his worship. The sounds of the ship's death, the groans of the metal, and the screech of tearing hulls rang in his ears. But the voice remained steady, unbroken. Zal stumbled over debris, the walls around him shuddering as the ship seemed to collapse in on itself, the star's gravity inching ever closer to tearing them apart. But the voice urged him forward. It was all he could hear now, all he could focus on. And somehow, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the certainty of death that surrounded him, there was something in those words, something that made him believe he could survive. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was hope. But he found himself reaching the pod bay doors, his hands trembling as he worked to activate the emergency release, his fingers moving without thought to the familiar controls. Despite the chaos, Zal's mind was still torn between disbelief and confusion. Who was this human? How had they found him in the first place? Why would they care to save a Karnathi warrior, someone who had led countless battles against their people? But the voice didn't answer these questions. Instead, it only guided him forward. The pod door opened with a hiss, the small cramped space before him a temporary refuge from the dying ship. But still Zal hesitated, standing there for a long moment, his breath slow as the reality of his situation began to settle over him. He had lost everything: his empire, his people, his fleet reduced to nothing more than ash scattered across the stars. He was alone, and yet this human voice had reached him, pulled him from the brink of death, and now it offered him a chance to escape, a chance to survive. He glanced back at the ruins of his ship, the vastness of space beyond, and then the pod waiting before him. He could hear the voice once again, this time firmer, as if urging him not to hesitate, not to let this final chance slip away. "You're not dying today," it repeated. Zal felt something stir deep inside him, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Fear. He was afraid of what might come next, but also afraid of staying stuck in the past, unable to break free from the life he had known, afraid of what his future might hold if he accepted the help of a human enemy. The pod was there. It was his last chance, and for the first time in his life, he realized that the fight for survival wasn't always about victory on the battlefield. It was about the courage to take a chance, even when the outcome was uncertain. He stepped into the pod, his body shaking with a mix of fear and something new, something he hadn't felt in so long: hope. He closed the door behind him and in the silence of the pod he let out a breath as the escape launch sequence began. He had made his choice. Now he would see what fate had in store for him. The pod lurched into motion with a sudden jolt, the force of the launch throwing Zal back against his restraints. As the cold emptiness of space rushed up to meet him, the pod shuddered and groaned under the pressure. But the human ship was close now. He could feel the gravitational pull of its magnetic tether, drawing him and pulling him towards safety, or what he hoped was safety. Everything in Zal's mind screamed for him to stay alert, to be ready to fight, to protect himself. But his body was exhausted, his muscles aching with the weight of the last hours of chaos and destruction. All he could do was watch as the human ship grew larger, filling the view screen of the pod. The battered cruiser appeared fragile in the face of the vastness of space. Yet there was something unwavering about it, something that defied the odds of its survival. Just like the voice head, Zal could hear the hum of the pod's thrusters firing, adjusting its trajectory. As it hurtled toward the human vessel, the once powerful Karnathi warship was a distant speck, now lost in the void. As the human ship loomed closer and closer with every passing second, Zal's mind swirled with 1,000 questions and doubts. But none of them mattered now. All that mattered was the ship, the voice that had guided him to it, and the overwhelming uncertainty of what was to come. As the pod neared the side of the ship, a loud mechanical click echoed through the small space of the pod, the magnetic clamps locking onto it. With a precise motion, Zal's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him more than he had ever felt before. This was no longer about survival. It was about what happened after he survived. What would the humans do with him? Would they treat him as a prisoner, or would they allow him to walk freely on their ship? Was he to become a symbol of their mercy, or a tool to further their own goals? He didn't know. He didn't understand any of it. But there was no turning back now. The pod doors hissed open with a blast of pressurized air, and Zal felt a surge of cold as he stepped out onto the human ship. The unfamiliar scent of metal and machinery filled his senses. The dim lights flickered overhead as a group of human soldiers emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised. They moved quickly and decisively, but their leader was not among them. Instead, the officer, the one who had spoken to him, the one whose voice had cut through the chaos, stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Zal's with an intensity that Zal had never known from his own people. It was not a look of fear or hatred, but something else, something he couldn't quite place. The officer said nothing at first. He just studied Zal, as if weighing his next move. Then he raised his hand, signaling the soldiers to lower their weapons. Zal stood still, his chest rising and falling with each breath, unsure of what to expect. But the officer's voice broke the silence, again steady, calm, and filled with a strange sense of authority. "You're safe now." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Zal had never experienced from an enemy before. He could not understand how this human officer could offer him such words after everything he had done, yet the officer's gaze was unwavering, as if this was the only truth that mattered in that moment. Zal didn't know how to respond. He didn't even know what to feel. All he could do was stare at the officer, the one who had saved him when there was no reason to do so, the one who had defied the laws of war and mortality. And in that moment, Zal realized that his survival was no longer just a matter of fate. It was a choice that had been made for him by a human who had seen something in him that no one else ever had. The officer stepped closer to Zal, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The crew behind him lowered their weapons, but they did not take their eyes off the Karnathi captain. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire ship was holding its breath. Zal stood still, unable to look away from the human officer, whose presence seemed to fill the room in a way Zal had never experienced before. No fear, no anger, only resolve, a strange kind of authority that Zal had never expected from an enemy soldier. His thoughts were clouded by confusion and disbelief. How could a human show such restraint? How could they offer mercy to the very creature who had fought so fiercely against them? The officer did not speak immediately. Instead, he motioned to one of his crew members, who approached with a medical kit. The human began to examine Zal's wounds quickly and efficiently. Despite the strange situation, Zal felt a brief flicker of gratitude toward the human officer and his crew, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. Who were they to save him like this? What did they want from him? The officer finally spoke, breaking the silence once again, his voice calm and steady. "We're not here to make you suffer, we're here to give you a chance." Zal blinked, confused by the simplicity of the statement. What did the officer mean by a chance? He had no place in this war anymore. His people were finished. His empire was a dying relic, a forgotten history. And yet here he was standing before a human officer who was offering him something Zal had never thought he would receive: mercy. Zal struggled to form words, his mind still reeling from the shock of his survival. But the officer didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, he motioned for Zal to follow him through the corridors of the ship, the cold metal floors echoing under their footsteps. The crew fell in behind them, but kept their distance. Zal noticed that the humans did not seem afraid of him. There was no hate in their eyes, no distrust, just something else: curiosity, maybe, or pity, but none of the venom he expected from his enemies. He glanced back at the medical team working on his wounds silently. They treated him with an efficiency that was almost clinical, but there was no malice in their hands, no sign that they were treating him like a prisoner or a threat. No one spoke about the war or the consequences of his actions. They just worked with a focused determination, as if saving his life was their only goal. Zal could hardly believe it. The entire situation seemed unreal. The war had been his life for so long that the idea of being treated with anything other than contempt felt alien to him. Even now, as he walked alongside the officer, he couldn't shake the sense that this was some sort of trick, that there had to be a hidden agenda behind this act of kindness. But the officer's gaze never wavered. It was clear and unwavering, as if he had made a decision and would see it through no matter what. The ship hummed softly as they moved deeper into its heart. Zal could feel his strength returning slowly, the rush of adrenaline fading as the medical treatment began to take effect. But the weight of everything still lingered on him, the weight of what he had lost, what he had done, and what the humans might want from him. When they finally spoke, he wasn't sure what to expect. But when the officer finally spoke again, his words were even simpler than before. "You're not our enemy anymore." Zal stopped in his tracks. Those words resonated deeply within him in a way he didn't fully understand. Was it possible to leave the past behind? Was it possible to start again, to move beyond the war, the bloodshed, the empire he had fought for his entire life? The officer turned to face him, his eyes full of quiet resolve. "You're alive. Now you have a choice." Zal looked around the ship at the humans who had spared him, and for the first time since he had been rescued, he realized that he had been given something he never thought possible: a chance to live on his own terms, a chance to forge a future beyond the war. Zal stood still in the middle of the corridor as the officer's words echoed in his mind. "You're not our enemy anymore." Those words felt strange, foreign to him, as if they had no place in his life. Had he really been given a choice? Could he truly walk away from everything he had known? All the battles, all the victories, all the hatred and bloodshed, could it all be erased in an instant? He looked around at the humans on the ship, their eyes curious, but not fearful, as if they saw him not as a threat, but as something else: a wounded soul, a broken soldier, a being deserving of the same mercy they offered their own. There was no mockery in their gazes, no hatred, just something almost familiar, something he had never known, but had always wondered about. The officer stepped closer to him, his voice steady and clear. "We can offer you a new life." Zal didn't know how to respond. He had never been given a choice like this in his life. The Carnathi had always been about duty and honor, the belief that their empire's survival was the only path to greatness. Now here, he was standing on a human ship, not as an enemy, but as someone they had chosen to save, to offer a future to. It was too much to comprehend, too much to process. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The officer nodded, as if expecting the silence, and then said, "It's not about who you were, Zal. It's about who you can be." Zal turned his gaze to the floor, wondering if he was losing his mind. He had never imagined a scenario like this. He had fought against humanity with everything he had, and now they were offering him a chance to live among them, to live for something else, something beyond the war, beyond the empire. His head spun with confusion and uncertainty. He had no idea what he would even do with a second chance. All he had ever known was war. But there was something inside him that made him want to believe. The officer's words made him want to find out what life beyond the battlefield could be like it was a terrifying thought, one that threatened to strip away everything he had ever believed in. And yet there was a flicker of hope, something that had been buried deep within him for so long. Zal took a slow breath and looked up at the officer who was waiting patiently for him to make his decision. His face calm and steady, the weight of the universe seemed to rest on his shoulders. In that moment, the fate of his future hung in the balance. But the officer's gaze never faltered. He stood there not as an enemy, but as someone offering Zal something he had never expected: the possibility of redemption, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by his past. Zal felt his heart race as the decision loomed over him, his mind torn between the soldier he had been and the man he could become. He thought of the Empire. He had served the Empire that had consumed everything in his life. And yet, in the face of all that destruction, the officer was offering him a way out, a chance to start again. Zal could feel the tension building in his chest, could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. But the voice of the officer cut through it all. "You're alive. Now you have a choice." The choice was his, and for the first time in his life, Zal realized that he didn't have to fight anymore. He didn't have to be defined by the war. And as the weight of that realization settled over him, he made his decision. He would take the chance. He would walk away from the war, and whatever the future held, he would face it not as an enemy, but as a man who had been given a second chance. Zal stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between him and the officer, the weight of his decision hanging in the air like a thick fog. The officer didn't press him, didn't rush him to speak. He simply waited, as if he knew the decision was one Zal had to make on his own. Zal could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the enormity of the moment pressing down on him. He thought of everything he had left behind, the people he had lost, the battles he had fought, the empire he had served. All of it was now a distant memory fading into the background of his mind. What had it all been for? What was the point of all the destruction, the bloodshed, the years of war, if they had led him to this moment? A moment where he stood on the brink of something he could never have imagined, something he had never allowed himself to dream of: freedom. It was terrifying in its own way to think of life without the constant threat of battle, the feeling that each day could be your last. He had always lived with that, but now he had to choose a life without that constant rush. The officer was still waiting patiently, his expression unreadable. Zal took another breath, and for the first time in years he let go of the rigid discipline that had defined him all his life. He let go of the anger, the pain, the hatred that had consumed him for so long. He let it all wash over him and disappear into the quiet of the ship, the stillness of the moment. He looked up at the officer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I accept." The officer nodded, once his expression softening for just a moment. "Thank you, Zal," he said, his voice low and sincere. The words felt like a weight lifting off Zal's shoulders, and for the first time he realized that he wasn't alone anymore. There was no empire waiting to rebuild him. There were no warriors to follow him into battle, no one to tell him what to do, but there was something else. There were people around him who had chosen to see him as something more than an enemy, something more than a soldier. There was a chance here, a chance to live differently, a chance to make something of himself outside the confines of war. Zal felt something stir inside him, something new, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there, flickering like a candle in the dark. He had never been given the luxury of hope, not in his past life, not in his time as a captain leading his people to victory and defeat. But now he was given a new path, a new beginning, and the possibility that it wasn't too late for him to change. For the first time he looked around at the humans aboard the ship and didn't see them as enemies. He saw them as people just like him, people who had their own hopes and dreams, who had chosen to offer him a second chance. And for the first time in years, Zal felt something inside him shift. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he would not face it alone. The officer motioned for him to follow again, and this time Zal did without hesitation, his footsteps steady as he walked with the humans by his side. The past was behind him, and the future was unknown, but Zal was no longer afraid to face it, and for the first time he allowed himself to hope that whatever came next, he would be ready.